Thank you for joining today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag session, helping students get the most out of group work. Our presenters today are Major Kristin Kepler from the Graduate School of Nursing, Dr. Linda Macaulay from the ETI, Dr. Beth Marcellas from the ETI, and Mr. James Schwartz from the School of Medicine. To start us off for today's session is Dr. Marcellas.
As you saw, we are going to be talking today about group work. And let's start off by taking a quick look at some of the benefits of group work. So, one of the biggest benefits of group work is the opportunity it provides for active learning as students work together to complete a task, teaching and learning from each other as they go along. Now, research shows that students working in small groups tend to learn more of what's taught, and they retain it longer than when the same content is presented in other instructional formats. This is most likely because of the active learning that happens as they work through assignments, teach each other, and help each other along. Another key element of group work that's beneficial for students is this broadening of perspective. So working in groups gives them experience considering the viewpoints of others and exchanging ideas. So as they go through this, it starts to cause them to challenge their own assumptions, and it helps them to change their perspective. Another really important element of group work is the fact that it really emphasizes communication skills. Students have to use different skills than they would use if they were working individually in the first place. And then it also requires them to use sort of formal communication skills. A lot of students today are more used to these informal communication skills. And when they come out of school, they may not be as used to trying to communicate in a more formal way. So working in groups really forces them into a little bit of a more formal mode, which can be very helpful. Another key element, we know that the heart of the USU education is leadership development. And group work is really a great opportunity for students to practice their leadership skills. Now, the leadership framework that they use at USUS is called the leader-follower framework. So it's important not just to be a leader, but also to be a good follower, to know what you need to do, what your role is to help the team succeed. So in group work, in the academic setting, students can learn to take both of those roles. Sometimes they're going to be a leader, but they also are going to be able to practice their followership skills. And finally, we know that in the military and in healthcare, teamwork is really a part of what we do every day, and it's crucial to getting things done. So doing group work helps students prepare for life outside the classroom as well. Now, you've probably heard students complaining about group work, and maybe you've even been one of the students complaining yourself. So group work does have a lot of benefits, but it also has some challenges, and we have to certainly acknowledge those to help us think about how to avoid them as well. So I'm going to talk a little bit about the challenges now, and then later in the presentation, we'll talk about ways that you can structure assignments to avoid them. What are some challenges you've experienced, heard about, or maybe even fear in terms of doing group work as an instructor, really? There's a lot of things that we can do to help mitigate some of these potential issues with group work. The social loafing, the divide and conquer approach, those are some of the issues that can come up with group work. Either you're going to have students say, oh, okay, here's the assignment. I'll do this, you do this, you do this, you do this. And then you put everything together and we never have to communicate. We just do our own little bits. And that really, we talked about some of the benefits of group work, of sharing perspective, sharing ideas, and working together. And you miss out on that if you don't have this well-structured assignment. Some other elements that can cause problems are time, as we have someone say, poor use of time. And that's important. It can take students a lot more time to do the group work together than it would take them to do it individually. So you have to make sure you acknowledge that and provide them with information about time. A good structure of the assignment is going to help them make sure they're using their time effectively. Social loafing is when, as we said, one person is going to be able to hide and not do work when there's enough other people doing the work. That can be an issue, and that's frustrating for the people who are doing work, as well as the people who, as I said before, the people who aren't doing the work aren't really getting the benefit of the assignment. So that can be an issue for them. Team personalities A lot of folks sort of have this implied in some of what they typed into the chat. But yeah, if one person takes over, it really ruins the experience for everybody. And again, doesn't let them get the benefit of those broader perspectives and the active learning that they might have otherwise. And then finally, this idea of, not this again. All of these issues can lead to people to feel like group work, group projects are more trouble than it's worth. And, this idea of are students learning what you want them to, that I think someone typed in the chat, um, it is an important consideration, right? Students kind of feel like the faculty member's the expert, and, they may not get what they think they should be getting out of the class, or you might not be sure that the students are getting what you want. But again, a lot of these challenges that we've brought up, thanks everyone for participating in the chat, can be mitigated by good design of your instruction for the group work. Let's think about some of the techniques that you can use to make group work more effective. Uh, Now, students who complain about group work may be complaining because they've experienced some of those challenges. Now, as I said before, I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the techniques you can use to overcome the challenges. And then we're going to have Mr. Schwartz and Major Kepler and Dr. Macaulay talk about how some of the group learning activities they've developed have incorporated these techniques to really make successful learning experiences for their students. What kind of work is appropriate for group activities? There are a number of elements that make an activity appropriate for group work. And a big one is relevance. The project should be clearly related to the goals of the course and the lesson objectives. And ideally, it should also have relevance outside of the classroom. Complexity of both process and product is really important for good group work. So, what I mean by that is that the task should have enough elements that there's going to be work for everybody. If students could do the work on their own, it's not really going to be a good group assignment. That should be an individual assignment for them. Also, we talked about some of the benefits of group work and active learning. You get that most by incorporating some higher order thinking. Really more complicated activities are better for group work. You'll want an activity that's going to require the group to discuss and debate concepts and come to consensus. That's when you really draw those benefits of the communication and the broadening of perspective that group work does so well. So, for example, if you took an assignment where you asked students to identify 3 areas in a state where hunger is a problem, that's kind of a fact-finding mission. People can go off and do that on their own. Sure, they could divide and conquer, but they're not really going to collaborate on anything to make that a complicated assignment. But if you instead ask them to propose 3 ways to improve access to healthy food in a local food desert, then you're getting to something with a little more complexity that's going to require them to really dig into some of the information, have some conversations about, well, is these are all some things you could do, but which of those is the best? And again, if you ask them to come up with a lot of options and then narrow it down, you're going to have even more opportunity for them to do that kind of complex group work that really is going to be beneficial for them. Another key element of an appropriate activity is interdependence. And I'm just going to read a definition. So, positive interdependence is when students work together to accomplish a shared learning goal, and each student can achieve his or her learning goal if and only if the other team members achieve theirs. And that's really the hallmark of an effective group project is when the students know that they're depending on each other, and it really helps them to engage and motivate with each other when they know that others are relying on them to get the job done. That's really an important element of a successful group activity. So once you've started to think about, okay, this assignment is going to work for a group, you also want to think about how you're going to group the students so that they can do the work well. Now, obviously at USU, in some situations, the students are already grouped for you. So, for example, in the School of Medicine, they'll be in fire teams. But also, a lot of you may be teaching in times when you do have the ability to use different kinds of groups. They're not preset into groups, and you can choose yourself to use groups. So if you think about that, let's look at some of the things you can think about as you're putting your groups together. One of the first ones to think about is group size. And this is one of the elements of groups that has kind of the most consensus in the scientific literature. And that is that 3 to 5 people is really the sweet spot for group work. If you have fewer than 3 people, you're not really going to get that kind of mixing of perspectives and the collaboration that you need. If you have more than 5 people, though, then you run into the problem of social loafing and people maybe not having much to do. So it may depend a little bit on the complexity of the assignment, but really in general, for most assignments, 3 to 5 people is going to be a good number. So once you know how big you want your team to be, you also are going to think about how teams come together. Are you going to let the students pick their own teams, or are you going to pick the teams for them? And there's definitely benefits and drawbacks of each of those options. If you're letting the students pick their own teams, you may want to have some constraints on it, or you may not. You may think about whether you can sort of prevent cliques from forming or getting people, working only with the same people all the time. That can be an issue. So if that's a concern of yours, then you may want to pick the teams yourself. If you pick the teams yourself, that does give you more control over a wide variety of variables. And you're probably going to have students who aren't used to working together. They may develop better work habits. So that can be a good option as well. Another thing to think about is whether you want teams together for the short term or for the long term. If you're doing more than one group assignment in the course of a semester, do you want the students to keep working together, or do you want them to break up? Or if you're doing multiple assignments, should they be with the same teams all the time, or should they break up in the course of the semester? That's really, it's up to you. There's, again, benefits and drawbacks of both. Really think about kind of the goals of the assignment and how the teams are working together. Um, if you think you want to, break that up in the middle of the semester, that can be very effective. But on the other hand, if the teams really would benefit from splitting up a little, go ahead and do that in the middle of the semester. There's no hard and fast rule, but those are definitely things to think about in advance, so you're not sort of in the midst of the heat of the moment trying to make that decision. And finally, there's also important elements of external factors. One of the easiest one to think about is time, right? If you've got students who are, especially if you're in a distributed learning course, people are all over the country, you may want to think about grouping people by time zone. If you have people together, even in a face-to-face classroom with different levels of experience in the field, maybe you want to have people grouped based on experience, and so that people can teach and learn from each other. If you want people different experience levels together, or maybe it's going to be important for people at the same experience level together because the activity is going to benefit for people with a similar knowledge base rather than trying to have people too varied. Again, it's going to depend on the assignment, but you definitely want to keep those ideas together. Quickly, we want to talk a little bit about assessment. It's something to think about really before you get started, before you even introduce the idea to your students. So you want to think about a few elements that are going to affect the assessment of the students. First off, think about if everybody in the group gets the same grade or the student's going to get different grades. If they're getting different grades, how are they determined? So whatever you choose, make sure that you have a very good rubric so the students know exactly what their grade is going to be based on, whether they all get a 1 grade or each individual can get a different grade. Now, technology may factor into this. If you use a learning management system, you'll want to find out what its capabilities are for grading students. Can you actually give all students the same grade easily? Can you actually give students different grades easily? That's an important element, and Dr. Macaulay is going to talk about that a little bit later. Another element is whether you want students to have 1 grade or multiple grades. So is there just a final product, and that's what that's what the grade is going to be based on, or are you giving them different grades throughout the course of the assignment? Can they get a process grade and a grade on effort and a grade on correctness or effectiveness of the solution? There's definitely a lot of things you can grade them on if you want to give them multiple grades. Um, but it's something to think about really, obviously, before you get them started on the work. So once you've gotten all the information together, you know what the assignment's going to be, you know what your teams are going to be. You want to go ahead and start preparing your students to work in groups. Now, as I mentioned before, sometimes students are going to think that you're abdicating your responsibility to teach them if you have them work in groups because you're sort of letting them teach themselves. Um, so that can really develop dissatisfaction in students. So that's why it's really important if you do choose to do group work that you let the students know why. What are they going to get out of the group work that they couldn't get by doing the work on their own, and communicate that to them very early in the process. Um, and it's also helpful to let them know that it does require special skills and make sure that you give them the skills and the tools that they need to succeed. So you can start, and this is one of the most important elements of having a successful group project, is by giving them structure. Make sure that the assignment and any materials you give them really make clear what they need to do to succeed in the assignment. Um, Now, what the structure looks like is going to depend on the learning activity, but at a minimum, you have to have very clear objectives, a very clear description of the assignment and the final product, and especially a rubric on how you're going to be assessing that final product. Now, in some cases, it may be helpful to go a little farther to define tasks that the members of the team are going to need to do, and to make sure that they have clear roles. Not all tasks, not all projects and group work require that, but that can be very helpful for some of the more in-depth assignments. And it also can help. We talked a little bit earlier about sort of problems with social loafing, personalities, people not doing the work. If you have specific tasks and roles, that can really go a long way towards helping structure the assignment and getting the students to do what they need to do and build up that kind of interdependence where they see how they're connected to each other. And finally, you want to make sure that you give them the tools that they need. And this might mean tools available to them in the learning management system. So there's some tools available to them in Canvas, the learning management system. They may also be able to use external collaborative tools like SharePoint or Google Drive, depending on what system you have. Or possibly you'll need to give them guidance on special skills. There may be some skills that they need. Maybe they need to know some project management or collaboration or decision making. Different assignments are going to really require different types of skills. You want to prepare your students and make sure they have those skills before they get started. Or maybe, like Mr. Schwartz, you'll need to build an actual specific technology or a paper based tool to lead them through the assignment. Now that we've talked about getting the students set up for success, let's think about one last thing as they really to let them hit the ground running. You want to empower them to be able to work together effectively. And they're most likely to have a positive experience if they start by setting expectations for how they want to work as a team. Empowering students to decide for themselves how they will get the job done really contributes to the development of mutual respect and interdependence that allows them to work together and feel like they can rely on each other. So one way that a group can come together to identify their shared expectations is by putting together what they might call a contract, and that can help guide their work together. So it might cover who does what, it might cover when or how they meet, or how they make decisions. And you can find a number of examples of these, group work contracts online. But it can really help students think about how they're going to work, how they're going to get the work done. And really, an important role is that it establishes team roles and expectations, and it can reduce the problems with dominant personalities and social loafing that we've talked about that can really kind of ruin that group work experience for students. As we talk about a contract and the social loafing, that makes you think a little bit about accountability. And that's an important element of group work. And there's multiple levels of accountability in a group project. So as a team, students must get together so that they can get the work to you in accordance with the structure you gave them. But the individual level is where it can get tricky. So as you think about it, if they have a team contract, the individual accountability might be an important part of that team contract so that they know that how they're going to work together, how they're going to be able to rely on each other. Um, and you may also want to think about incorporating peer assessment. That can really be an important element of accountability so that the students know that their teammates will have a chance to weigh in on whether they were a good team member. So that'll make sure they try and stay engaged, they do the work that they need to do. And it can reduce the problems with personalities and work styles. Also, as we think about conflicts with personalities and work styles, that does raise an important point about conflict management. Now, that's a skill that obviously in an individual assignment you're not going to need, but for group assignments, you may need to spend a little time working with your students on conflict management. And you'll want to think in advance how you want your students to handle that. Do you want your students to work things out amongst themselves, or should they come to you at the first hint of a problem? That's going to be an important part of the process and the expectations that you set for them. So really make sure you've thought through that and that you communicate to the students what the process should be if they have conflicts within the team while they're trying to complete the work. Make sure they know what to do if that happens during the course of the assignment. So finally, you want to think about once you've got them all set up for success and they know what they're going to do, you want to be sure that you don't just leave them hanging, right? Make sure that you give them support as they're completing the activity. So you both monitor their process and provide feedback on what they're doing, the work, how they're working together. All of these things are going to make them feel supported so that they realize that you are teaching them throughout the process. You haven't just left them to do it on their own. Now, the way you're going to do this depends on a lot of things: the assignment length, how the student's working. Are they in the classroom with you? Are they outside of the classroom? For shorter or in-class work, you can certainly visually monitor them and go around from group to group and give them, immediate feedback. For longer projects, you may want to have them have specific check-in points, schedule milestones for them so that they have the opportunity to get feedback from you and you can make sure that they're making good progress and that you can see how they're working together as a team. These are all really important things to do throughout the course of any group work that you do with them. Now that you know a little bit about how the structure of a group assignment can help your students, let's listen to some examples from your peers. So, Major Kepler, if you'd like to go ahead and talk about some of the ways you've used group work at USU.
Yes, I would love to. So, and I speak kind of on behalf of the TSN, but I'm going to talk a little bit about some of the courses that I'm a part of and some of the group work that I've been able to either develop or kind of continue to grow or change as we see fit. And so I was just going to kind of compare and contrast like two courses that our FNP, our family nurse practitioner, women's health nurse practitioner, and a little bit of psych mental health nurse practitioner students are able to kind of participate in through our program. And because they're kind of different, but really kind of interesting the way that they work. And so for the response to military sexual assault course, even some of you on here may have potentially kind of assisted with the SIM event that we do because it's a collaboration with the School of Medicine and with the GSN. But this is a course that the GSN students participate in sort of while they're out on a 10-week clinical rotation, leading up to that culminating kind of SIM event where they actually encounter a standardized patient who has recently been sexually assaulted, and they just kind of have to think through how to help that patient navigate. And so the coursework is mostly didactic. They're provided with some readings and some policies and maybe some video lectures just dealing with different things. And then they are put into small groups by faculty. We assign them to their small group, and then they actually meet twice while they're out at clinical rotations. They'll meet virtually and they'll have a small group discussion about some of the content and just reflecting on that. And we felt that that was most appropriate because this is pretty heavy content. It's kind of emotionally charged content. So we wanted everybody to kind of be in the same group to kind of build that rapport. Most of them, yes, they know each other. They've been in coursework together, but they may, especially since there's some psych mental health nurse practitioner students and some FNP/women's health nurse practitioner students, they may not have been really close. And so we try to make sure that we're keeping them in the same time zone since they're out at clinical rotations and also giving them kind of hopefully a safe space. And so that's kind of grouping mindfully, right? and thinking through that versus the OMR course, the operational medical readiness course. So that's a course for FNP and WHNP students who sort of surrounds that MCM course and the Bushmaster experience that maybe we're all kind of familiar with. And it's a course where we have multiple group projects that we think are very beneficial application wise for providers who will be, seeing active duty patients and dealing with military families and some of those things that go on. So they'll have a project where they work on a med board presentation, like maybe in the Air Force, we have the AMRO committee that meets kind of monthly where the PCMs can give input on a member and whether or not they should be med boarded or not. So they get to kind of think through the whole practice of writing a NARS and presenting to that board and things like that. Also like a medical threat brief. So thinking about if a unit is going to deploy, maybe a medical officer is going to need to give a briefing to the commander about the threats in the area and how they can mitigate those threats. And so for those groups, we actually tell the students that they can form their own groups, but we have some kind of right and left kind of barriers that we want to keep them within. So we kind of want them to kind of be able to move around throughout the semester. So if they work together with these people on this project, we recommend that they not work with them again. And that way they're just getting some broad experiences. And then also we really want each group to have a Navy member, an Army member, an Air Force member, and then sometimes like a public health member. And that way they're able to get just kind of different perspectives and think about things through those lenses. And so we find that they end up really enjoying that and getting to know each other in a lot of different ways. And it can help with networking. So those are some of the ways that we think through the group work in the GSN as far as grouping mindfully, just talking through the planning and preparation. So we just can't reinforce enough that it takes a lot of time. And a solid group assignment or group work is going to take a lot of time to plan. And that's really important because you're kind of like letting the students go out and do some things, but you want to make sure that they have really good expectations and instructions. You want to make sure that you're being clear on what level of mastery you want them to sort of achieve. Is it more just exposure and kind of understanding that content sort of for the first time and working together on how they understand it and building off of each other's perspectives? Or is it more on the application level where they gotten all the information and now we're going to apply it to like a scenario, or we're really going to practice how we're going to actually play, right? And then just showing them why it matters and why it's important to their future career. And so, being able to give all of that up in advance can be really helpful. Just continuing to kind of support and empower. You already kind of showed them why it matters, but as you go through the project, if it's a really good group assignment, they're going to continue to see that. And you're going to continue to kind of reinforce that, supporting them in their activities, just having checkpoints for that course for the military sexual assault, that response to that. For those small group like meetings that they have online, we always offer that a faculty member be present if they want. And we also try to give actually pretty quick feedback to those recordings so that they can kind of feel supported and empowered as they go through that. And then for the medical threat brief assignment, we tend to either play the role of the commander or we actually try to get, like a higher level, someone with command experience to kind of be in the room when they're presenting that medical threat brief so that they kind of get that perspective of what really matters to a commander and they're able to get that practice and that feedback. So those are some of the important, I think, group work examples that we have in the GSN. And so now I will pass it on to Mr. Schwartz for some review of his infamous group assignments that I think we've all come to love.
Well, thanks, Major Kepler. I appreciate the nice introduction. So I'm James Schwartz. I'm in the Department of Military Emergency Medicine in the School of Medicine. And what I'm going to talk about, well, let me back up. Major Kepler talked about group work across an entire course. What I want to do is dive into some group work for a very specific activity and kind of just show, some of the ways that we attack some of the group work. So, one of the things that this is an activity that the second year students do as part of Medical Field Practicum 102, the Advanced Combat Medical Experience. It's done in August, just after they've been here almost a year. They do it as a fire team, so there's roughly 4 to 5 students per team, and the teams have already been set up by the School of Medicine, so we don't have to worry about actually setting those teams up. It's done in about a 4-hour block of instruction. Faculty for this, when we run about 24 groups at one time. So I don't have a one-to-one faculty to team ratio. And I'll kind of get after how we get the feedback and how we use the faculty for this. But I typically have what we call roving faculty in the rooms assisting the students with the group work. So one thing I hope that you recognize, this is this is a poster. It's actually a 3 foot by 2 foot poster that each team is given as their product for the end of the activity. And Dr. Masalas talked about the what, not this again. And what we hope for is when a student comes in and sees this poster sitting on the table, that it immediately engenders curiosity and maybe some engagement right off the bat. As you can see, there's a lot of different things going on in the poster. There's maps, there's diagrams, um, there's a TC3 card there. It's colorful. There's a helicopter. Who doesn't love helicopters in posters? So immediately you hope that you get some sort of engagement, and the student says, "Oh, wait a minute, this might be a little different activity than what we're used to when it comes to group work, right?" There's also a student guide that we provide. So we talked about some of the structure and the resources, as well as some manipulatives that we use through the activity. We'll kind of talk about those as we go through. So these are 9 different areas, or actually 10 different areas that I kind of want to hit on as we go through the activity, which will reinforce some of the benefits as well as some of the challenges that were discussed earlier in the talk. So beginning one with the career progression and the relevance, right? So Dr. Marcellas talked about, whatever you do in the group work, you got to make sure you linked in to your objective. So you can kind of see the objectives here for this activity. So one, it's career relevant to them as a military medical officer. It does take them a little bit out of their comfort zone from complexity standpoint. Most of them come in and feel like, hey, my job is to treat the patient and all this other kind of planning stuff with logistics and mission analysis and that kind of stuff. Somebody else will probably take care of that. But we let them know, no, wait a minute, you're responsible for this. And so this activity is the introduction to those sets. So it takes them a little bit out of their comfort zone with the complexity piece. But again, it really ties into the relevancy and the career progression. So one of the things that Dr. Masalas talked about is giving them some structure. So the poster is designed exactly for scaffolding, right? It's a structured activity that walks them methodically through the process of one, tactical combat casualty care within the operational environment with some health service support planning, as well as some patient treatment, triage, and evacuation embedded within it. So it's a very structured activity that walks the student through. And again, that's through the design itself of the structure. And I will reinforce that it does take a lot of time, like Major Kepler and Dr. Marcells have talked about, to develop these kinds of things to really get after those objectives and that rigid structure that you want the students to follow. So one of the things that Dr. Marcells talked about is the divide and conquer attitude that you might get with some students. Hey, you do step one, you do step three, you do step four. We'll kind of come together at the end and pull this thing. And we really don't want that. We want the students to work together as a team methodically through the activity. So in this activity, everything is sequenced, meaning that you can't move on to the next step until you've completed the current step that you're at. The next step requires information from the step that you just finished. So it's very sequenced. So they can't do the conquer and divide piece as they go through this. So again, it forces them to work together as a team for the process. So again, we talked about leadership, right? So in this activity, the students, we allow the students, to empower which step they want to lead, but at each step, one student has to take the lead for that, for bringing the team through that step. So it does a couple things. One, it kind of puts that barrier on that social loafing. So we know that every student is going to have to at least lead their team through one of the steps. It also helps kind of quell if you have a very dominant student or a dominant personality that's really either excited about the activity, engaged in the activity, or knows a lot about the activity and kind of wants to takes it over. So it kind of puts that student in the follower role. So everybody gets the opportunity to lead as well as follow. So we make the students actually write their name, like who's doing the leadership piece for this step. And when we go back and look at the posters, we check that every student took that. Doesn't mean they have to know the answer for that step. They just have to lead their team through that step. So again, we talked about resources and tools in the beginning of the discussion here. Last thing we want to do is to frustrate the students as they go through the activity. So we want to make sure that we give them all the information that they need. Again, it's time limited. It's only about 4 hours to get through this thing. So we want to make sure that they have all the information that they need kind of at their fingertips so they can work through it. So you can see there's algorithms that are embedded in the poster. There's a crossword puzzle. There's diagrams. There's some maps there. So you give them quite a bit of the resource. You give them all the resources and tools that they need to be able to work through this thing. We also bring resources and tools in through technology and through Google Forms, which we'll talk about here shortly. Again, getting back to some of the complexity, as well as we want the teams to do some critical thinking. So in this part of the exercise, the students have to determine what's the best way to lay out a treatment area in support of receiving patients. So they have these casualty management icons, which are actually stickers that they'll kind of, they'll use to develop the best way to lay out their treatment areas. And then they'll have to defend their layout to one of the roving faculty members. So this usually generates quite a bit of discussion amongst the students and a lot of critical thinking on the best way to set this up. So again, technology. So we use technology in this activity, one, to bring data in, to provide data to the students, and also to pull data from the students. So as the students walk through each one of the steps, typically at the end of the step, they'll go to this Google form, and you have them pull it up through a QR code or through a link. They'll go to the Google form. And typically what we do is we ask the students to transcribe information from the poster onto the Google form as kind of a check on knowledge. This also helps us to do program evaluation at the end. You can take all that information, you can pull it together, analyze it, and kind of see how the teams worked through the activity. And at the end of doing the check on knowledge piece, there's typically immediately following that some sort of immediate feedback that's given to a student, whether it's the answers to the check on knowledge or to the step they just went through, displayed in a diagram or in some sort of text, or we actually bring in a lot of times panopto videos of faculty providing feedback to the students. The great thing about this is, one, that feedback is standardized between all 24 teams. So all 24 teams are getting the exact same feedback. So you can control for the feedback that's been given back to the students, as well as it keeps the students on the same track as they move through the activity. So peer teaching. So again, group work also opens the door for peer-to-peer teaching. So in this activity, there's a time where students are directed to determine the best intervention for managing an airway. We typically have an airway management trainer in the room. And so the group will walk over to that airway management trainer, and they will actually have to do the skill that they determine is the best intervention. A lot of times what you'll find is maybe one student is stronger than another student in actually doing that intervention, and you'll see some peer-on-peer teaching going on during this time. Obviously, we have a faculty member who's kind of monitoring it to make sure everyone's getting, the same information. But this is, again, is a great opportunity for that peer-to-peer teaching that you can find in group work. So feedback, again, we talked about the importance of giving that immediate feedback as you're working through it. We don't want them to go through a 4-hour block instruction and get the feedback at the end of the 4 hours. We want to provide that feedback as they move through the activity. One, to keep them on track as they go through the activity, to kind of correct any defaults or anything like that the students are seeing through it. Again, we do that through either the Google form, or a lot of times we do Panopto links, which bring in video feedback from faculty. Again, the other great thing about this is it standardizes your feedback that all the teams are getting. And lastly, Dr. Marcellas talked about the assessment piece. So for this activity, there's actually 3 assessments. There's an individual reflection that each student has to go onto Canvas and actually do the individual reflection. If you look at the last piece on that individual reflection of upload a picture, in the past, I've had a lot of students wanting to keep the poster, and we actually collect the posters up, right? There's one poster for 4 students, and we actually collect the poster up. But now what I decided to do is, hey, I make them take a picture of that treatment area layout piece, and they have to submit that to Canvas. But I also let them know that that's an academic or an educational artifact of the activity. So they have that artifact. And what happens is, later in the curriculum, they're going to come back and they're going to be asked to set up again a treatment area layout. And so, I kind of hint to them like, hey, you have something that you did this once before. You actually have an artifact. Maybe you want to pull that artifact out and see, does that artifact help you with the current problem that you're working through right now? So again, we have that piece in there. Then there's the group assessment, which is actually completing the poster and turning the poster in. And then the last thing we do is we do a peer assessment. So each student does a self-assessment on how well they believe they were prepared for the activity and contributed to the activity. And then their teammates will also assess them on how well they prepared and contributed to the activity. And then they'll get feedback from those assessments. So again, this is just the rubric that we use for the peer assessment for the activity. So with that, that concludes my presentation. I'm going to hand it off to Dr. Macaulay, who's going to talk technology.
So now let's take a look at how we can use some technology tools to appropriately support group work activities. The first tool that we might want to use if we are considering group work is Adobe Acrobat. As we shared earlier, you might use this tool to create a group contract. Specifically, this tool is useful because we all have access to it already, and it allows digital signatures. This will empower your students to create that contract and come up with the rules and regulations they want to work under, and then make sure that you have complete buy-in by making them sign it with their digital signature. Another option could be to use Google Docs or Office 365. This allows students to collaborate in real time, and it allows you as the faculty member to track the contributions of each of the group members with the version history so that you know that everybody actually has participated, and hopefully then you don't have so many social loafers along the way. You also could use Google Meet or Microsoft Teams or other web conferencing software. This allows your students to work on assignments at the same time, but in different places. It also allows them to record the work sessions so that you or they can refer back to them if needed for any problems or concerns that may have arisen in the work. And it would allow your students to utilize AI note-taking, which might facilitate conversation and allow them to capture ideas for brainstorming sessions more easily and automatically. If we think about combining both the Google Meet or Microsoft Teams and a collaborative document like a Google Doc, you can use both of them together. And one example I have of that was quite effective, rather accidentally, was I was planning on teaching a lesson to my class and it snowed. So we were forced to use Google Meet and Google Docs in order to execute the lesson, but it actually worked out better that way than when I used to do it in the classroom. So I ended up opening every group's Google Doc on my screen, and I could watch what they were doing in real time in the documents, and then use the Google Meet to hop into breakout rooms with them to listen in on their conversation or to help them if I noticed them going off track on their document. And that was much more effective than when I was in the classroom because I could hear each group more easily and literally see word for word what they were doing as they worked, so I could catch the mistakes before they went too far. It was so effective that every other year since then, I have now taught that lesson virtually via Google Meet and the Google Docs because it actually worked better than when we were in the classroom. And lastly, Canvas Learning Management System has a group assignments checkbox assignment setting that you could use if you are using group work with your classes. So if you are doing the Canvas setting for group assignments, you want to make sure you check the box only when students are working together on one submission. The benefit here is that once one student in the group hands in the assignment, you have to grade it one time, and everybody in that group will get the same grade and all the feedback that you put on that assignment submission in Canvas automatically. But if you are doing group assignments where students are working together, but each student must submit their own work so that you can individually grade and provide feedback to each individual student submission, then you do not want to check the setting box for a group assignment in Canvas. If you're interested in learning more about how to set up group assignments in Canvas, we do offer regular Canvas training every month, and one of the topics we present is efficiencies for working with Canvas group assignments. So if you are interested in that topic and want to have us schedule that training for you specifically or a small group of your colleagues, please reach out to eti@usis.edu and suggest some dates and times that you would be available for that training, and we would be happy to add it to our training schedule for that particular month. And now I'll turn it back to Beth to bring our session to conclusion.
Thanks, Dr. Macaulay, and thanks, Mr. Kepler and Mr. Schwartz. I hope everyone at the session really enjoyed the opportunity to hear from some folks who are doing this, so you maybe got some ideas. You don't have to do everything that these folks are doing, but really think about what they talked about and that you can use. But I think hopefully the big takeaway today is the key to successful group work is planning and preparation. You want to make sure your students, you know why your students are doing it this way, and your students know why they're doing the work as a group. And then also make sure they know what they need to do, when they need to do it, and what they'll be graded on. These are all things that will really help them come out of it feeling like they had success, they really enjoyed it. Make sure that they are working together, they know how to work together, and they know how to deal with conflict if it arises. And these will really, so hopefully the next time they hear group work, they won't say, oh my gosh, this is going to be a terrible time. They'll say, I'm excited. I know what to do. This is going to help me in a lot of ways. So once you set your students up for success, they'll just have a great opportunity to take on new roles and practice skills that they don't get from other types of learning.
Thank you for watching today's Teaching with Technology Brown Bag. You can view all Teaching with Technology Brown Bags on the USU YouTube channel under the full ETI playlist. Have a nice day.